As you're well aware of, and part of the discussion goes back to, we held our 5th Antimicrobial Stewardship Symposium last year in November in Atlanta. For those of you who've been to at least one, you know that in each symposium we've had a lot of great information. This last symposium was no letdown from the previous times. One thing I think we need to be aware of as we talk about the reviews of these symposiums, and we have some former chair people in the room, is the progression that this whole thing has evolved through. Our first symposium, we had ag talking to agriculture, and that was about all that was there. As we progressed to the next one in Ohio, we actually had one MD there talk for a half hour, then leave. And as we moved into Kansas City, we got more involvement from the CDC and the consumer side, having Angus, some retail chain there, grocery suppliers there, and different groups. The big thing that we really progressed on, with the help of Steve Solomon from the CDC, was when we moved the meeting to Atlanta for the 4th symposium, and that brought in a lot more of the human health side with the USDA and CDC. FDA has been involved all the way through, but it really made a big jump that year. And so our next goal was, once we progressed through from bringing them in, getting all the stakeholders at the table, was to move into metric forming. And then what are we measuring? As we progressed into the 5th year in Atlanta last year, we attempted to move through and really hammer down some of those metrics. With that, we performed a series of breakout sessions looking at different short-term, long-term, and mid-term outcomes. And I have those actually on a Word document on that computer and on that one, so I won't put those up right now. But when we looked at that, we were able to at least pin down and look at 4 or 5 top metrics that we went through our breakout sessions. And so those were taking the human side, animal health side, the stakeholders that were there, and trying to determine what actually were metrics that were acceptable and feasible. So we've had those discussions. Probably the best way to go through what we accomplished in the last antimicrobial stewardship survey is go through the survey post meeting. But as with most organizations, as you'll see in some of these, as we look at these symposiums, you see in the survey, is that it's easy to start those first discussions. And with NIAA, it being the kind of the old guard on the block, we've been doing it longer than a lot of people. You're well aware of the many activities that have spawned off Presidential Council for Antimicrobial Resistance. Every organization, every producer group, everybody's out there is talking about antimicrobial resistance. They've all drawn off some of our materials. We produced 5 white papers in the process. And they've all drawn off materials. I think everyone's running into the same roadblocks that we hit as an organization. As we discussed and identified the topics, talked amongst ourselves, talked amongst the human side, and then rolled into metric building, where we can get feasible, actual usable metrics, every group, I think, is at that point now, that whether they sprung up recently or whether they've been doing it for half a decade like NIA is, we've hit the roadblock of finding feasible, attainable metrics that can be used in both our industry and accepted on the consumer side. And so you'll see it kind of show up in some of the survey as I go through that. The symposium, we did a kind of a short survey afterwards, I think if you were there participated in, looking at some key questions. And we'll kind of go through those now before we move on to the next speaker. So one thing, what was the key takeaway from the symposium as a whole? And I think after reading the 40-some responses, that one thing is, it's complex. I mean, you heard the BVD talk today about, if you're in the bovine side, that everything is a complex issue. Antimicrobial resistance has so many stakeholders, so many avenues, and lacks so much data to address those issues that is a very complex, convoluted subject. There's a lot. One consensus was moving together towards metrics is the key, as long as all stakeholders are at the table. So that's nothing new that we haven't really expressed. it tells us going forward that, and you'll see it expressed in some of the later questions, including AMA, making some moves deeper into the human health side that we haven't done yet is going to be critical in getting in addressing this problem. What was the most valuable part of the symposium? And we should commend NIAA for creating these types of issue symposium. The top over resounding response was networking and reaching to stakeholders in other parts of the industry I don't work with. That was a key one that was up there. So I actually got a set next to. For instance, I'll use an example. There was a pediatrician from the Pew Foundation at that symposium. Dr. Dave Seclocha presented a talk on how their operation, which is a cattle feeding operation in southwest Kansas, handles disease and antibiotics in their operation. The pediatrician from the Pew Foundation came up to me after the meeting, after his presentation, and goes, "Where do we get more information like this?" And I go, "Why?" He goes, "Well," I said, "Where do you get your information now?" Which is a typical question you ask, right? He goes, "Well, the only thing we know about food animal production is from the movie Food Inc." That should be a telling sign for what their perception is and how it's driven. I mean, these symposium act as and I've heard it. If I've heard it once, I've heard it 10 times from the CDC and any type of governmental or regulatory body, a safe place for open discussion. And that's one thing that this has always fostered in these symposiums. It's always been a safe place that you can have open, frank discussions, and not just all and productive discussions. And so that's one thing that came up with. We had quite a few panel discussions this year that we had a lot of value. Another coup de grace that the NIA had was bringing Tyson, Costco, and Yum brands to the table and getting their perspective on the issue. And with that perspective, there was some mixed emotions in our survey. That some thought it was pushing an agenda, others thought they were genuinely happy to be there, and that their opinion was well valued. So I mean, it's still a little bit of a break in our group looking at what they brought to the table, not knowing who our respondents were, but having them there and giving that next step is key in solving the whole equation. And so we look back, it was generally accepted, 82%, that the goal, as we look back at that symposium, in a quick review, the first presentation, first section was historical perspective, going back over the last 4. They gave them a good overview. And then our second session was the one I mentioned that Dr. Seclocha spoke at, as well as representatives from other species, and our environmental factor. So one thing that was well received was a presentation on sludge, slurry, and environmental impacts of antimicrobial resistance and how that's treated going forward. So that's one thing we'll probably look at including in our next symposium. It really shows that through the whole work of the planning committee and the group, that the more we encompass, the more we realize it's a complex issue, but the more we get closer to looking at metrics that could be valuable. And that was part of the outcome of that. Was the goal of the third session achieved in providing a more detailed perspective of human stewardship programs? So the CDC, we had some state health officials there, all spoke on what's currently happening in stewardship programs in their systems or in their hospital systems. One being that a lot of the Canadian systems, as well as human hospital systems, are adding stewardship officers, and so they're going through some type of extra oversight in prescribing these antibiotics. In the third session, we went through the straw man poll, and for those of you who don't know the straw man poll, it's almost like a roadmap or map from a perceived outcome and laying back through metrics and how do you get there by implementing short-term, mid-term, and long-term outcomes. The typical feedback we had were the metrics presented in the third session that you feel could be applied in similar way to antibiotic stewardship programs and animal agriculture. A lot of it was, we went back and through that, we didn't have enough time to review stuff. So as a planning committee, in our review was that we needed more input from the FDA, USDA. One thing that was people felt in the survey afterwards was they thought, and if you heard Dr. Jones' presentation as he talks to producers in Georgia, that the government would be there and want to help. You know, FDA, USDA, CDC would have more of an idea of how they wanted their metrics to work. As we discuss the VFD later on, get the industry perspective, we'll realize that they kind of went into that a little bit with not having everything planned out. There was a lot of feedback that we needed more input from FDA on that process. But with that, was the goal of the retail panel accomplished? Overall, we had a very positive response from the retail panel. They talked about their position on where they felt basically that if they paid for it, if they could supply it and they paid for it, they'd do it. But if they still put function on the fact that they want to be at a competitive advantage to provide a wholesome, safe food supply. Their comment on growing organic markets was in that market is growing. I think the big takeaway was they are looking at things differently than they did in the past. If you talk about the consumer panel, instead of just looking at it from a food safety standpoint, they're now looking at it through different views: food security, animal welfare, public perception. All those wrap back into their decision-making process in their boardroom. So they're adding another layer in their decision-making, whether it's just profitable, whether it's safe, whether it goes back to another layer of input they have on that consumer marketing. And I know a lot of the organizations and companies out there are addressing that also. So we had the fourth section was the regulatory agencies, and let USDA, Farm Foundation, CDC, and FDA all give their updates. And once again, we know that things are moving forward, that there are between PCARB, between a lot of moving parts that are going on in the industry. And so those were all positive feedback. An interesting one here was the question regarding understanding the perspectives of others regarding possible metrics around antimicrobial stewardship, and did promoting discussion regarding metrics appropriate for antimicrobial stewardship. This is where we get into that area that we talked about, hitting that roadblock. And so if people have been close to it and involved in a long time and they step into this discussion, it appears that we get some negative feedback. We're not getting to the point where we're getting the right discussion. So as a group, as a planning committee, as an organization, it's an opportunity for us to advance that going forward and really take a look at those issues, dig a little deeper into why we're not getting the stewardship program. One comment was transparency among all stakeholders, that we're sometimes in the past, there's been a little bit of we try and push things maybe as a more direct science that we know what we know, but we're not good at expressing it to other people in the way they understand it. And so that's a big probably part of this, given that we had such a mixed and diverse audience, that the fact, and I go back to the fact that someone could sit there and hear what we think is common knowledge about standard practices in our operations and go, we had no idea. That's a big thing, and it says a lot of outreach and education will probably be a key part going forward. With that, the final one was what context should be considered, and there's a lot of discussion in that. One was how do we tie back to all the other stakeholders, and that's obvious in a lot of our discussion. So with that kind of covers my initial foray into any questions. Okay. with that, I don't know how we're doing on time. Oh, right on time. Good. So, with that, thank you for your attention. Our first speaker of the day is Mr. Gary Huddleston. Gary, if you want to come on up. We asked Gary to come in, and our apologies for the title of his talk. When we met previously and we talked about the veterinary feed directive, one thing we've heard discussion from veterinarians, from producers within this organization, from regulatory people, but where the rubber meets the road is going to go back into the people that have to deal with it every day, and it goes into the feed industry, because they're the ones that they're the ones that if something goes wrong, their license as well as the veterinary license gets yanked. And so what we wanted to bring to the table today is Mr. Huddleston to give us just a kind of perspective of here's what we're looking at from the veterinary feed directive from the feed industry. So